and we look forward to that. Brethren, if you see on here in the program, this a step further toward the kingdom, and actually the whole title is COVID-19, a step further toward the kingdom. It's a question that I will ask, and we'll see what the answer is as we go through. Zephaniah 3:8 talks about waiting on the Lord. Wait for me, declares the Lord, for the day when I rise up as a witness. Indeed, my decision is to gather nations, to assemble kingdoms, to pour out on them my indignation, all my burning anger, for all the earth will be devoured by the fire of my zeal. It's not a pleasant scripture, but we know that that's really the end game that takes place before the things we heard about in the first discourse from Brother Emmanuel about this full setting up of the kingdom. And that's an important overview to think about when we consider some of the things that we're going to consider today. I want to frame this around volume 4, only because volume 4, Pastor Russell in his day talked about the Battle of Armageddon. Now, it's true, he believed that would be over in 1914, but he made 10 key points in there that I think are just as important today as they were there and just as relevant regarding the gospel age harvest. Even though that harvest, as he said, the harvest is not ended, it goes on. These 10 key points that we can take out of volume 4 make it still just as relevant today as it was in the expectation that the brethren had at that time. I'm not going to talk about all 10, but I want to share those with you. Number 1 was there would be an increased ease of life, and that would create wider discontentment among the people. Wealth would compound phenomenally, but it is never enough. Number 3, the ease of the labor burden produces more hostility between the workers and the owners. Number 4, the increased knowledge, and I put in parentheses here, social media, question mark, alerts many to what they don't have. Number 5, all nations want to share a piece of the pie. Number 6, we have a conflict between the haves, those on the right, and the have-nots, those on what we today call the left. That increases, and we see that gap widening. Number 7, nations' increased debt leads to bankruptcy. It stirs financial panics and defaults. Keep that one in mind as we go forward. A worldwide revolution of the discontented. Real legend. Keep that one in mind. Mainstream religion. The beast, the image, the false prophet, those things we heard about earlier, a wonderful presentation leading up. Mainstream religion makes a comeback. That's what things the pastor talked about, and we believe how that happens, we don't actually know. And number 10, governments dissolve through the overthrow and through anarchy. And that's basis was Ezekiel 37, 38, 39. So that's kind of the framework. And as you can see, those 10 key points are pointing really in this harvest today as much as it was before, although we see different challenges at this time of the harvest than we did before. So what I want to talk about here is assessment of our time now in the harvest. This is actually a two-part talk I'm working on, the perils of the late harvest, which comes later, sometime later in the future. But this is an assessment of today, our time in the harvest. I'll talk about number 1, the coronavirus impact, and that'll be kind of work for a lot of it. Number 2, an unpredictable America. Number 3, the China regime regression. Number 4, a vacuum in Europe. Number 5, Middle East combustibility. And number 6, well, question mark. You'll see when we get there. So let's look first at the coronavirus impact. Gretchen and I and Sandy Thomason, who's online, we were in Australia in January and February. Just rumors breaking out on this, and the fires were burning. That was the main topic, the fires burning in Australia at the very time we and many of you were at this convention in Anglesey. Well, that bushfire catastrophe seems like a distant memory now, doesn't it? The coronavirus pandemic has taken Australia deeper into the unknown. Australia at one time was called the miracle economy because it avoided the recession during the 2007, 2008 financial crisis. It avoided the worst back in 1997 when we had the Asian financial crisis, the dot-com bubble, which was in the early 90s. Now, 1 week, first week, about 1 million Australians became unemployed, 8.9%. It's about 1.4 million expected. Now I see it's up to about 1.6 million. And the JobKeeper program that was introduced in Australia probably has prevented a 15% unemployment. That's just in Australia, and an orientation for many of you I know that are on now. That economy in Australia was once dubbed the wonder down under, but the International Monetary forecasts the whole economy to about 6.7%. UBS Asset Management, one of the largest money managers in Australia, forecasts a budget deficit for the country of 300 billion Australian dollars next year, 16% of the national income. So you've got 25, almost 26 million people primed for a war, but it's a war with an enemy that no one can see. And the European impact has been just as devastating. Here you see what has happened to the world stock markets. All you need to do is see those lines. But Europe itself, Europe is in the midst of a downturn that they haven't seen since the end of World War II. The worst is yet to come. The French economy declined by almost 6%, Spain's by 5%, Italy's by 5%. The steepest downturns we've had in the European economies since the post-World War II period. Well, here in the US, the problems are still developing, as you know. But in the first 4 weeks that we had in April, 22 million Americans filed for unemployment benefits. And we had talk about technical glitches in what we're doing here. There were technical glitches in the unemployment category because millions of those Americans that were supposed to receive stimulus checks to help them from the US Department of Treasury never got them. Loans that were supposed to be given to small businesses by the Small Business Administration has run out of money for what it called its Paycheck Protection Program. So you can imagine the devastation that has been occurring to Americans who are suddenly out of work. Naturally, we ask the question, is this like the Great Depression of the 30s? Now, Brother Jim Parkinson and I have discussed this many times. I know Jim's feeling is that seventh plague that we have of Revelation is to be a worldwide Great Depression. Now, is this one, is what we're going to experience like the Great Depression of the 30s? Well, think about past depressions and recessions like the Great Depression of the 30s. It was all driven by the lack of demand. The consumer side of the economy drove that Great Depression. But this one, the current predicament around the world, is caused by the supply side. Everything that was functioning normally, or not even normally, it was functioning great. Then the world decided to shut down its economy. Perhaps this is more like what we had at the energy crisis of the 70s. But the key point is here is what happens when this is over. Will there be a recovery? Most economists predict yes, there will be a world recovery, but it's unknown. And when economists talk about shapes, of the shapes of a recovery. A V-shaped recovery, and it's just like it looks. You get a big drop and then a spike up. Possibly that happens. Or you get a U-shaped, which is rides down for a little while, comes back up again. That is more likely what happens in recessions, depressions. Or you get a W shape, which is like down, up, then a second wave down, back up. But the one everyone fears and no one wants to have is an L-shaped recovery. That means a depression that drops and never comes back for a long time. So at this point, because we're still all under lockdown, all not knowing what's happening, we really don't know what it's going to look like when it's all over. But there will be, we know, lasting ramifications on trying to fix this problem that we have globally. The US, Europe, we're going to be dealing with debt that will exceed as a share of gross domestic product, all the goods and services that are made in the country, the amount at the end of World War II. We're going to be trying to manage this massive debt that all countries have had to issue to reshape society. The balance between current generations and future generations could create great havoc and hard feelings that, remember that one mention that we made about the fact of the disruption and hard feelings and chaos created in the masses, because opportunities will certainly dissipate. Those that are waiting to do jobs may be offset by those who are trying to find new ones that were gone. So there are some lasting ramifications that we just really don't know. And you can see the global debt is on track to surpass 255 trillion. That's just from 2019. It's even going to be more as we go forward. Well, there's been a resurgence of the movement to say, can't we just cancel all this world debt if it's going to cause us such a big problem in so many countries? Let's talk about that for a minute. Lebanon and Argentina did default on their debt in 2020. That was before the coronavirus crisis. And it's not very well known at this point because that became overwhelming. But before the coronavirus crisis, the International Monetary Fund had issued reports that warned 34 countries were already at the risk of default. Remember that one point I showed you on those 10 bankruptcy around the world, countries. Jubilee Debt Campaign is a campaign that's a movement to cancel world debt. It was formed back in the 1990s, but it showed at that time 31 countries that were in a debt crisis and 82 were at risk. And the whole thing is, well, you understand from Jubilee, just like we had in scripture, every 50 years, debts get canceled and things start again. And that's what we had. Remember at point number 7, nations' increased debt leads to bankruptcies. It stirs financial panics and defaults. And so this whole movement started. So let's say, what would happen if this were true? What would happen now if all debts were just canceled by countries? Well, first, think of the utter chaos while you try to sort it all out. Who owes what, when, and how is it going to happen? Second, think about the people that are invested in that debt. Numerous pension funds, some that you and I collect money from. Other large investors that are heavily invested in what we call sovereign debt, debt of countries. They would go broke. Retirees, older people, be left in destitute and poverty, and small banks would collapse. Third, an effective transfer of wealth from rich countries to the poor countries if we just forgive them. Almost all the sovereign debt in the world in the poor countries comes from people in the Western nations. And if they've just lost everything on their investments, what happens? The fourth scenario, the sovereign debt market is presumably at least for the time being. Who's going to want to make that mistake again if they suffered 100% loss on all their investment? Countries would need to fund everything, all their own development from the current receipts they have, because there would be no borrowing at a national level, no bonds being issued to countries to finance infrastructure, living standards, deterioration. Some countries would cease to exist. That's the scenario of bankruptcy, and if you just cancel debt. So you see, the predicament that is created in all this is not as easy as it would seem to get out. It would be a disaster of epic proportion. So we have to scratch that off at the time. But that's a little feel for what the impact that we don't know this will have on our future. Number two, let's talk about the unpredictable America, or what I call the Trump effect. And doesn't matter, it's not a political statement, but this is what his whole position was. We must, as a nation, be more unpredictable. We are totally predictable. We have to be unpredictable, and we have to be unpredictable starting now. That was in 2016, and we can see that that probably has been the strategy going forward. But it has meant a changing strategy of the role of what was once the world's single, perhaps, superpower. I'm saying this again in a non-judgmental way, non-political way, but think about it. After World War II, the U.S. emerged in global leadership. Second, defense and promotion of the liberal international order. And by liberal, I don't mean the way we think of liberal today, but an international order. If you want to understand what the world was like from World War II up to this period of time, read Henry Kissinger's memoirs as Secretary of State. Defense and promotion of freedom, democracy, human rights, the prevention of the emergence of regional hegemons in Eurasia. The hegemons, remember, are those countries or people that want to just control everything. Today, what's the role? A restrained leadership, deter aggression through this unpredictability, defense of the values by country and interest, more realistic about what can be accomplished rather than aspirational, encouraging allies and partners in Eurasia to do more to defend themselves, things you really can't argue with as a citizen, paying attention to the state. But it's a change in the world, and that's what's important for us. Number three, the China aggression. Just 2 years ago, the Chinese Communist Party adopted a new principle called Xi Jinping thought. And it meant that installed him in until 2022. It elevated him to the leadership level of Mao Zedong. One man rules. What's his priority? It has been to overhaul the legal system, to rule by law, giving the state power to maintain control over politics, the social environment, and the economy. Remember, that's why you see suddenly 10 million cell phones disappear in China during this whole time. When Brother Emmanuel talked about tracking with cell phones, that's the way we can figure out how many people have been lost. But that happened in China, we've seen that. An ethno-nationality foreign policy, China only, not unlike what we see here. Chinese living outside the country, 50 million Chinese are living outside their country. And Xi's objective is to align their interests with their home. So what's the environment in China going to look like after the coronavirus? No longer are they dependent on exports. China is self-sufficient. Their workers are smarter. There's no shortage of capital despite their rising debt loads. And they're not returning ever to that mentality that we had of a stitch and sew factory work where people were making $1 a day to do Happy Meals for McDonald's. That China no longer exists. So what role China plays as we this coronavirus situation and their own situation will prove to be something worth watching. Again, we don't see a lot of answers at this point, but we see a lot of questions that can be raised about where we go in the future. Internally, China will be changed. There's been a generational awakening, and it matches what we've seen in World War II, after World War II, in other countries. The 2008 financial crisis that woke up many in other countries. Could social stability in China, where the economy depends. What emerges or what happens with that, we don't know. But there are questions now about, can you trust the government? Do we really have economic security? The way of life will face young people in China just as it will face in many countries. Will it trust the powers forward? In a consensus survey that was done not too long ago, there was a survey done by Pew Research, which is a very credible research center, on China's relations with other countries. And the consensus was that China plays a bigger role in the world today than most other countries. 70% of the people said that China plays a more important role in the world than it did 10 years ago. When we look at China, fewer shared interests, China, and a growing list of conflicts that they have with other countries. China is resisting anything that is standing in the way of their status as a superpower. Right now, they've had military activities going on in the South China Sea, the intimidation of Taiwan. We know what has happened with Hong Kong. Coronavirus has deepened the lowest of China relations with other countries. A new US State Department report concludes that there's been a compact of China, Russia, and Iran in the disinformation campaign about what has really happened. So again, this is merely getting out of the political environment, saying it's a new world in which we're emerging, and this drives us further along. The worldwide revolution of the discontent, real or imagined, I think emerges much stronger as we get through this period and get through this coronavirus crisis. Let's look at number 4, the power vacuum in Europe. Boris Johnson, Prime Minister of the UK, he felt the full impact of the coronavirus. We all know he had a 2-week-long battle with it himself. ICU doctors were making arrangements what to do if things didn't go so well. To stop the UK from officially leaving the European Union at the end of January this next year and entering this past year and entering a transition until the end of 2020. So that is going on in spite of all the things that we've seen. And that's caused a lot of issues because now it's emerging with those that are left. This is not the Europe we want. Italy, all the problems that Italy had, with the total lockdown of its country. But the nationalists there have warned the European Union chiefs there's a resentment against this bloc now about how they've handled the financial crisis in Italy, especially by the coronavirus pandemic. A bitter split is occurring in Europe over the extent the Euro area countries should be more unified in their economic response to this crisis. You see the picture on the right here of Carlo Calenda. He's the former minister and he's the permanent representative to the EU from Italy. He's admitted there's a crisis of faith in this institution that he's been fighting for a long time. What happens in Europe? How will Europe look 5 or 10 years from now? The 5th point is the Middle East combustibility. Little known and little hidden, and sometimes I wonder if all this to-do we've had in the world is because there's things no one is paying attention to going on in the Middle East. The Lord works behind the scenes, as we know. And there are right conditions, I believe, for an all-out war in the Middle East. Let's think about some of the things that have happened recently. September 2019, there was an attack on Saudi oil facilities. No one really can conclude who did it. Was it a rebel group from Yemen? Was it Iran? Was it the Shiite militia in Iraq? But the US military action against Iran prompted an attack on Israel by Hezbollah. You know, they've had to deal with that one day enduring 100 rockets shooting their way. Israeli operations now against Iran, allies, anywhere could trigger a regional reaction that would be across the whole Middle East. To summarize it, the Middle East is subtly on fire. Let's look at some of that. There's an internal conflict going on in Libya right now. And you know the relationship between Libya and Israel. But this internal conflict has involved Egypt, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, the UAE, Russia, and the USA. Many of those countries identified for us, perhaps in Ezekiel. The Middle East has become now the world's most polarized region. And as such, it's the most volatile that we have on Earth today. Three rifts that we have there. One is, of course, Israel and everybody. Second is Iran and Saudi Arabia. And third are the Sunni blocs. So this conflict in Libya is something that we all need to be aware of and keep our eye on. We know at that northern border, it's very difficult for Israel. There in Syria. Syria has a civil war going on that's been going on for some time. It's drawn in a dozen countries so far. Think about the estimate of total deaths by opposition activist groups, 384 to 586,000. That's as of March. The largest number of Russians ever killed by the US has happened in this Syrian civil war, over 280. But it has brought Russia, Turkey, Iran, and Israel to the very brink of war. Coronavirus has set that back for a while, but we'll see what emerges out of it. As we look at Israel's adversaries today, and of course we look at Israel as the time clock for God's whole plan regarding that setting up of the kingdom. The axis of resistance, which is four countries, Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, and Syria, that group has been very active and is being played out in several arenas around Israel, internally in Gaza and what I call Samaria, what is called today the West Bank. In Syria, it's being played out. It's being played out tremendously in cyberspace. We don't see everything that's going on there, but look at the Israeli intelligence and we see the challenges that are being faced in cyberspace. Lebanon, the Hezbollah that are in Lebanon, Iraq, and the Iranian allies. Now, curiously absent are most Arab states. But as we think about something like Psalm 83, I think Israel deals with most of the Arab states before the time that we believe leads up to that period of Ezekiel 38. Nowhere else, no other theater of the world is as current as the Middle East. War is prevalent. Nowhere else does the early 20th century violence still determine the conditions that are there. Think about the European Civil War. And I use that term to cover the whole period between 1914 and 1945. You know, we talk about two world wars, but it was really one long extended period of war. And many historians now refer to it as the European Civil War, that period of violence that occurred from 1914 through 1945. We had the Cold War that ceased in 1990, but tensions on the Arab world by World War I that came out of that 1917 period remain very acute. Now, I often wonder, also died before the Balfour Declaration was signed. And you see some of that in the writings when he talks about Jerusalem and the reemergence of Jerusalem, what he might have said about the Balfour Declaration if he were alive when it's signed. The Middle East today is really in kind of the same situation as Europe was at the 1919 Treaty of Versailles. Remember, that's when peace was made, because the ethnic, the geographical realities of that whole Middle East are ignored by the world. So I think there is a good case that that world is on fire. And so when we think about this last point 10, the government's being dissolved through overthrow and anarchy, we can see what might come out of this, how long it might take. But I think there's certainly cast more doubt. I also wonder, and I'll get to that, I have another point, we'll get to it a little bit later. Now, you notice I left out number 9, mainstream religion. There's a question mark there, and we heard a good presentation earlier on the beast, the image, the false prophet. But let's talk about the number 6 question mark I put up there. And it's the question we need to ask at the end of our assessment. Will this pandemic bring a new world? Question mark. It's Saturday here in the United States. I know it's Sunday there in Australia, but yesterday, May the 8th, Friday, marked the 75th anniversary of VE Day. That was the day that peace was signed with Germany, commemorated the end of World War II in Europe, and we could look at the headlines, Germany surrenders. What's happening now that we see that post-war world that we've had since World War II is sputtering. It's sputtering to kind of an end with all the things we talked about. This pandemic, what it's done is exposed the fissures, the holes, the separations of what has been former allies. Institutions that were created for global stability, things like NATO, the UN, International Monetary Fund, all those are brittle today. And that's where we don't know what happens if we go into something like that L-shaped recovery period. What happens to those institutions during this period of time? Are there lasting, world-changing implications of this coronavirus outbreak? This is a picture of the New York Fed, the New York Federal Reserve, and I have it there for a reason. Just last week, May the 4th, the staff Reserve Bank of New York, which is undoubtedly some of the most brilliant finance that we have surrounding. If you are a governor on the Federal Reserve of New York, you are one. You know that you are a top economist. But even the staff there are brilliant people. They looked at correlation. You know, I love the quants, loved a lot of PhD math students there. They love to correlate things. They looked at the correlation between the deaths that happened after the influenza pandemic of 1918 to 1920. You know, that's one that gets talked about in comparison with the coronavirus. Looked at the correlation between that and the extremist voting in Germany, 1932 and 33, that put Hitler into power. Let's take a look at what they found. They used the regional data that was available on the fatalities, the historical voting figures that were there, and their study found that the share of votes won by the Nazis was higher where there was a greater share of population that had died during the pandemic. They concluded that one of the 1918 influenza pandemic's consequences was disturbing. It was the resentment towards foreigners and minorities. Now think about that question mark that we had. What happens to the institutions? We talked about some of those earlier when Brother Emmanuel talked about the civil, religious powers and the civil especially. those things may get much more prominence going forward, and we may indeed see that rise coming out of this. But one of the disturbing ones relating to two of the things I've just mentioned is this correlation. The correlation between the influenza mortality and the vote share won by right-wing extremists is stronger in regions that had historically blamed minorities, particularly Jews, for the medieval plagues. One of the great things we're waiting for, we've had a tremendous movement of Jews back to Israel. And I think we could track it back. There are now more Jews in Israel than in any other country in the world singly. But the one area where we've still seen not, the one that's right behind it is the US and the Western world. So we wonder if coming out of this coronavirus implications as things start to get difficult. And you know, the human tendency is to find a blame for everything. Right now it's been the Chinese or whoever else. But if particularly we go into a period of recession, long recession, and we know that there's an extraordinary number of Jews that are operating in the financial sector, that might drive that Western group of Jews to reconsider about going to Israel. We think and expect one still big migration back to Israel before Ezekiel 38 takes place. Just something to think about. So the question, is this a final blow? Mark 2:21 says, no one sews a patch of unshrunk cloth on an old garment. Otherwise, the patch pulls away from it, the new and the old, and a worse tear results. Of course, Jesus was talking about those that wanted to keep and hold his ministry under the law covenant. But he said he couldn't let the Pharisees handle that. So you can't repair an old system. It's about putting a new one in. I think difficulties will continue to grow as we go forward. Isaiah 62:3 says, darkness will cover the earth and deep darkness the people. This past century, think about what we've seen. I've highlighted just a few of the things. Unprecedented economic, political, social upheaval. Any kind of oppression is no longer acceptable anywhere. Human rights issues have been taking such a great dynamic, now not just on a national stage, but on a global stage. The increases in an integrated, diverse population has raised level of discontent. Remember what I said about looking for blame and foreigners and what happened in before Nazi Germany came into power, has raised protests globally on both sides. The focus on rights has blurred the line between real human rights and perceived rights, just like I mentioned one of those 10 key points. There's confusion, there's chaos, and trying to appease all these diverse cultures and say, which one do we keep? I don't know how many of you read the book Animal Farm by George Orwell. Orwell wrote a lot of books against communism. The animals taking over the farm, and that's the whole point. They raise up and take over the farm. And they do away with all the laws, and they write their own commandments. They write 7 commandments on the side of the barn when they take over the barnyard. They gradually remove all the commandments until just number 7 is there. Number 7 commandment is all animals are equal. And one day, an addition was made to number 7 by the pigs who were the leaders. But some animals are more equal than others. Today, polarization has supplanted all animals are equal. And we're seeing this conflict and chaos resulting in the discontent of the masses. Today, selfishness, not love, reigns. Malachi says, we call the proud happy. They that work wickedness are set up, declares the prophet. We know that during the past 6,000 years, Satan has been deceiving humans through that principle of selfishness, a desire to be gods of the earth. Well, Jesus' kingdom, we know, will reverse that order. Love and preference for others will be taught, it will be encouraged, it will be rewarded. But it won't come suddenly. We've seen this doesn't eradicate things. You can't legislate morality. It won't come suddenly on the resurrection, but gradually. Because Isaiah says, when thy judgments are in the earth, the inhabitants of the world will practice, no, will learn righteousness. Now, it's not the traditional view of Judgment Day that we all know. It's used to frighten people into conformity. The true Judgment Day is for a different purpose, for learning and training. That new covenant that flows out from Israel is to teach each man to know the Lord, the least of them to the greatest of them, as Jeremiah 31:34 says. We can't change the hearts of men today, no matter how hard. But we can be ambassadors for Christ in 2 Corinthians 5:20. And how are we ambassadors? We exhibit a personal integrity in dealing with others. We can be objective and independent in a discussion of what's going on in the world around us. We can be concerned, we can't change the world, but we can be concerned with individual development of those that we care about and that are in our care. But we must continue to have an interest in the major problems of our day because it's affecting those with whom we will work in the kingdom. So in conclusion, let me give just a little bit of advice as we think about how we deal with everything that's been thrown at us in the last month and a half. The saturation coverage of events in the news that we see is often hyped up, it's often alarmist, it's confusing, it's exploitive, it's many times premature, and ultimately sometimes wildly inaccurate, no matter how the quote experts talk. Think about it, today's media, 24/7. It's everywhere, it's instantly global, and it's professionally produced and raw when it comes out of people's cell phones or elsewhere. It's like a cognitive tsunami coming at your head. The coronavirus has brought panic to the world. Incidentally, I think Michael Chow, who's a local photographer here in Arizona, is going to win a Pulitzer Prize for this picture you see at the bottom. He took it one day of a nurse, ICU nurse, standing where there was a rally by those that wanted to reopen the country. And it's all over the world. But this panic to the world can leave us feeling overloaded, scared, baffled. What do we believe? Cynical and belligerently opinionated. And we see that over and over. Understand one thing about media reporting. There's a high media reporting. Dealt with the media for much of my career. And this is a model what the media goes by. It's called if it bleeds, it leads. The worst news is always takes precedent. Events that happen are not trends. Okay? If present trends continue, always be skeptical of that. Apply skepticism to the most dire predictions and all prognosticators, and yes, including even me. No one can see the future except the Lord. Brethren, Philippians 3:20 says, our citizenship is in heaven, from which also we eagerly wait for a Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ. We must always represent the principles of God's word. We can't help influence the world's conditions, but we can be aware of it. We can encourage righteousness in what we would call our circle of influence. We can make a difference with those with whom we're acquainted. And I advise everyone, shampoo your hair. What do I mean by that? Well, now we have great shampoos and they don't burn your eyes. But remember, if you ever wash the baby's hair and you wash the baby's hair and it looks up and the shampoo runs in its eyes, and it looks down, the shampoo runs in its eyes and starts rubbing. No problem if you look up. Brethren, that's what we need to do. When we're confronted with all this shampoo flowing in our hair, we need to look up because that's where our deliverance comes from. According to his promise, we're looking for a new heavens, a new earth in which righteousness dwells. 2 Peter 3:13. To God be the glory forever and ever. Amen.